We do have kind of a lot to cover today, and I promise you the highlight of this morning will not be me, will be the panel that will follow me. So I'm going to try and condense as much high level information as I can into the next 30 minutes here. So Courtney, if you could just kind of keep me honest on time, that would be great. But we're going to try and just do a high level overview, really crisis communications 101 here. I know we've got a lot of different sized organizations, different folks in the room here. So I'm going to try and keep it pretty high level. I won't delve into who we are because Courtney did a great job of summarizing that. But some of the pieces and parts that I want to talk about today before we get through to the panel, really this idea of a crisis playbook and what goes into it, whether you're in the midst of a crisis or not, just the importance of having a communications crisis playbook in general. Talk a little bit about spokesperson identification and the importance of selecting the right person or people, social media in a crisis. We could probably spend 5 hours just on that bullet. We won't, but we could. The state of the media, not just because of COVID, but in 2020 in general, and then just some best practices for media relations. So the crisis playbook in general is a really important foundational tool for organizations. Whether it's something that you create and then you put on a shelf and you don't need to use, great. Most organizations are not that lucky, and that it's something that they keep going back to and keep building on and adding to. So just foundationally, what I'll say about creating a crisis playbook or thinking about starting that process if you don't already have one is that it is a living, breathing document. And it's really more of an art than a science. And it's never really going to be finished. So you're going to create something or add on to what you've got. And then every time something internal changes or a new issue crops up that you weren't anticipating, you're going to go back to that playbook and you're going to build it out. You're going to add to it. You're going to adjust it. So as much as it'd be great to say, once you create it, you're good to go and you're going to be set, it's something that definitely needs to be revisited. And the only other thing I'll mention before diving into some of the elements that typically you're going to find in a crisis playbook is that, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet to managing a crisis in the midst of a crisis. It certainly complicates things on a lot of levels and makes creating a playbook or finding the time to create this playbook that much more difficult. But I think because there's no silver bullet, doing all you can to prep ahead of time and just try and anticipate and look around corners for potential crises is your best bet at coming out of those on top. So when we talk about different types of crises, we Electricities had actually met with our members earlier this summer, and we did a whole crisis communications webinar, and we talked about a lot of the different types of crises. So this is by no means an exhaustive list for our members, let alone your organization's types of different crises that could crop up. But these are some of the types of crises that we see not infrequently, or just crises that we know are potential threats for us and for our members. So when we're thinking about as I'm going through kind of the different elements of the playbook this morning, these are just some of the things that kind of are in the back of my head when I'm going through the different playbook elements. So knowing where to start can be tricky, especially now, because in a year ago, we would have been able to all gather in a big conference, block a conference room for the day, grab all your stakeholders that need to be in the room, and then, be able to use whiteboards and sticky notes and be really engaged and interactive. Some organizations may still be able to do this socially distanced if their offices are open and if folks are still reporting to the office. So that's an option, but if not, there are still ways to do this virtually over the computer, over Zoom. It's not quite as war room feeling, but it's still an option for folks. But I think deciding who needs to be in the room is the first and very important step of doing this exercise, this playbook exercise. I've worked with organizations who have come to me and said, we want 50 people. We need our board in the room. We need our executive leadership in the room. And we need these other 20 staff members in the room. And that's really difficult. I think there is a sweet spot between having, 50 people in the room and having one person. You certainly don't want this to be created in a silo, but at the same time, having 50 people in the same room trying to put together a playbook can be tricky. So just thinking through who are the stakeholders who need to be in the room, maybe from a leadership perspective, but also from a subject matter expertise perspective as well, to make sure that you've got a nice rounded group for this. And this is the first question that I always like to ask once everyone's gathered in the room and we're good to go. This is the question that kind of kicks off playbook planning in my mind, is just very simply put, what keeps you up at night? This is a great way to get your team engaged and just talking. And again, typically we would be in a big conference room and we could have big sticky notes and everyone would grab a marker and we'd be writing down kind of what keeps them up at night. It's a little difficult now, but you can go around your Zoom boxes and just have everybody kind of, raise their hand and shout out really what keeps them up at night. It's really hard to plan for a crisis if you don't know what's lurking, around the corner, or you don't know where all the skeletons are buried. So it's really important to ask this question and to allow enough time for everybody to really think about all the different things that could come up. After you kind of map out, or at least understand the universe of potential crises that could come up, and depending on how much time and capacity your team has in the process, what I like to do from there is kind of prioritize those crises. So what are the maybe tier one, if you will, types of crises that are most likely to come up? And then maybe tier two, these are probably lower priority and less frequent, tier three, and so on. That just helps when you get into thinking about including some messaging in your playbook, helps you to prioritize, knowing full well that you can't, go ahead and write messaging documents for 85 issues. Next, what you're looking at here, the RACI model, is pretty popular. It's used in most, if not all, types of crisis playbooks, but it's just a framework really for going through your internal team and assigning roles and figuring out who's on first, who's responsible for what. So when we think about the responsible party or parties, these are the folks who are the doers. They are the responsible party. There can be, certainly multiple folks in this bucket. The accountable bucket, it's really important to try and keep it, if at all possible, to a single person. This is the person who ultimately, they're the decision maker. The buck stops with them. They're ultimately, going to say yay or nay on the plan moving forward. This consulted group is typically, and this can be many different individuals, departments. These are the folks a lot of times who are subject matter experts who you're going to want to, consult with before making any decisions. So they probably have more fine-tuned information, more specifics on issues that you might not be privy to or aware of. It's just a good group to make sure that you've done your due diligence and touch base with. And then informed, this group, you're not necessarily going to asking for information necessarily or permission for sure, but you do want to keep them in the loop. So this might just be just a little music interlude here. But this informed group is really just a stakeholder group that you want to make sure stays in the loop. You don't want to have to, you don't want to forget about them, but you also aren't looking for permission necessarily from them. Once you kind of understand and have on paper as kind of a chapter in the playbook, who's on point for what, it's then important to look at your external stakeholders and figure out, okay, what are the different groups that we need to be communicating with? And this is just, these boxes that are up here are just some examples from thinking about some of our members and kind of the different high priority groups that they're going to be thinking about, but getting on paper all of your whole universe of your people, so that you do not, in the midst of a crisis, you don't have to say, who do we need to talk to, and who do we need to, and in what order, and with what message. You at least already have these groups on paper, and okay, we talk to our employees, we've sent an alert out to our customers, we've sent an email to our business partners. It just helps you think through and kind of prioritize all the different people and groups that you need to work with and talk with. I won't spend too much time here on the stakeholder continuum, only because This is kind of phase 2 of what I would consider crisis playbook planning. Best case scenario, you've got a whole host of stakeholders from the prior slide who you would identify as kind of an advocate or a champion for you, so that, heaven forbid, for example, there's a negative media story and something blows up online, and you need to go to some of your advocates and champions and say, hey, we need to activate you, and can you go on social media, and can you write a comment on this news article, things like that. So that's kind of a phase 2, stage 2 of the stakeholder planning. And we could spend a whole 2 hours just on figuring, stakeholder mapping and the continuum itself. So one piece of crisis communications that often gets overlooked because everyone's, and rightly so, very concerned with the external audiences, the media, boards, things like that. But internal communications, I just can't stress enough how important it is to make sure that everyone on your internal team is aligned and everyone feels like they're in the loop. They at least know what's happening. Obviously there are going to be some details that maybe cannot be shared organization wide, but so that employees understand at least what's happening, so that they don't feel out of the loop and that they don't say something that is contradictory to the message that you're trying to push out kind of with your core crisis team. It's just as important to talk with and to communicate with your internal team as it is your external stakeholder groups. Another piece or chapter, if you will, of kind of this crisis playbook planning when you're sitting down with your core group is to go through a simple SWOT analysis and really just quadrant out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, where do you see opportunities, and what are some of your biggest threats. And this isn't necessarily going to lead you to, here are the types of crises and here's how we're going to, deal with them. But it is an important, I think, fact-finding mission to go on. And you might find with some of your weaknesses that, there are some opportunities that you might want to prioritize internally that will help combat some of those weaknesses in advance of, the next thing that could hit. And none of this, just to be clear, none of this needs to happen. The playbook doesn't need to be this perfectly crafted, beautiful document. As long as it's, and I find it very helpful for it to be an actual physical thing too. Yes, it's going to live electronically, but it is also, it's just very helpful in the thick of things to be able to pull it off of a shelf and open it up and kind of go down the list. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily needs to be this beautiful document that's, a beautiful piece of creative. So just don't worry about it looking beautiful because you're going to be changing it pretty frequently, hopefully. Another kind of chapter would be messaging and an audit of your different assets. So knowing full well that no one has the capacity to be able to create messaging for all of the things you said that keep you up at night, but at least having in the playbook, physically in the playbook, some general messaging, and that could be simple boilerplate language, just kind of your go-to one-pager messaging document about your organization and things like that. It's helpful to just have that up to date all the time in the playbook. There are some templated communications that may be helpful for your organization to create, just so that you're at least 50% of the way there, for example, when something hits, so that you at least have a starting point and you don't open up your computer and you're staring at a blank screen. You at least have something to go off of, whether that's press release templates, Q&A doc or talking points, draft customer communications, if it's a recurring crisis, if you will. So, we're dealing with some remnants of a storm now here in Raleigh, but, storm communications are something that happen frequently. Unfortunately, and having some of those social media messages, for example, and social media graphics done and baked and ready to go just saves a lot of time and stress in the long run. So that's just another templated communication that you could have at the ready. And then visual assets too, things like logos and the correct, high-res file formats, headshots. If you have B-roll, having B-roll available and just stocked away somewhere, it just saves time and stress down the road. And then channel updates, just doing a quick audit to make sure that your social media channels are up to date, Your website has the latest and greatest information on it. All of your external facing channels are up to date, so that when you do need to post something there, people don't go to your website or to your social and you haven't posted in 6 months, and then it's going to look a little fishy if you're trying to win back some reputation points. Once the playbook is, you've got some of these elements in the playbook, heaven forbid something happens, you go through this crisis situation, which I'm sure is fun for no one. Probably after you're through the thick of it and kind of through the storm, you probably just want to put it behind you, not think about it ever again. It's really, really important to conduct debrief postmortem meetings with your team. It's not always fun, but it's a really great way to take stock of how things went. What worked really well during the crisis? Where do you need to, maybe make some improvements before the next one hits? And then really just taking those lessons learned and updating the crisis playbook. So as much as these may not be fun, they're very, very valuable in the long run. We're going to switch gears a little bit here and talk briefly about spokesperson identification. And this is another piece that would really go into the playbook, just, recapping who your spokesperson or spokespeople are. But whether you have one spokesperson or multiple spokespeople, selecting the right people or person is very important. These are, again, very general. I'm sure these are a surprise to no one, but asking yourself these questions as you're selecting or redefining your spokespeople are just good first steps here. So, obviously, or maybe not, but do they have the authority to speak on certain issues? So is this person able to speak on behalf of your organization? Can they make themselves available very quickly? Media have a quick turnaround time. Their deadlines are not 4 days, it's maybe 4 hours. So can they be readily available should media come knocking? Are they comfortable in front of media? Are they comfortable in front of a camera for a broadcast interview? Are they, comfortable doing a radio interview? Would they be okay picking up the phone and talking with a reporter on the record? And then are they, well-versed in what they are going to likely be asked? So is this a situation where you need somebody who's very specific on a certain issue, or can you have somebody who's a little bit more general and broad? It's all going to depend on the situation and the reporter and kind of the homework you've done on the outlet, but it's important to just think through these things. And then have they been media trained? That's something that is very, very valuable if you can do it. It's something that I've done a lot with individuals where we will actually, sometimes it's planned and that it's just me or one of my colleagues who's kind of conducting, who's the reporter, and we've got a camera rolling and we're capturing it on film so that whoever's on the other side can then rewatch. It's painful. It's always painful to watch yourself, but to be able to watch themselves and see, what not only their body language and their cadence, but also the words they used in their responses. And sometimes we'll do it. I've done this with different folks and organizations too, where it hasn't been planned necessarily, and that the spokesperson doesn't know that me or someone else is going to be calling them as a reporter, which is the ambush method, which is a little bit different, but still valuable in working through some of those issues. And then preparing spokespeople. So once you have these folks selected, making sure that you're not just saying, okay, great, you're a spokesperson, best of luck, but really setting them up for success and helping to prepare talking points, Q&A docs, or sometimes they're called charge and response documents. They're very helpful too, because you can kind of go through the universe of potential questions that you might get asked, and then you can really help to formulate those responses and look around some corners and just try and help and think through some of the questions that the spokesperson could potentially be asked. Facilitating a media training. Again, if it's something that you have an opportunity to do, for sure, I would recommend taking advantage of media trainings. Same thing with crisis scenario kind of run-throughs. Those are also very helpful if and when time allows. Compiling media kit assets ahead of time too, and having those as part of your crisis playbook, so that, again, if a reporter calls up and they're talking with your spokesperson over here. Somebody else can be sending along their headshot, their bio, your logo files, all of that, all of those visual assets. They're going to need to go along with the interview. And then preparing your internal team. And by this, I mean talking with your internal team about what the process is and what your organization's procedure is should media contact you, so that whoever picks up the phone is prepared and knows and understands what the process is and doesn't feel pressured to answer questions on the record in real time over the phone, and understands kind of who those requests need to be funneled through appropriately in the organization. Brand consistency is another piece of the spokesperson pie. Once you've got the messaging set and they're ready to go, before the camera rolls, making sure that there's consistency for your organization, making sure that you're protecting and portraying the brand correctly through branded, whether it's a situation where it makes sense to have a branded step and repeat behind you, whether your clothing wise, if there's anything branded that needs to be present, obviously the message consistency, and then the assets like we talked about. And the only other thing I guess I'll mention here, what I think I mean by consider the setting is really, if it makes sense for the spokesperson to be in a suit and tie in their office, great. But if it's a storm event, for example, and it makes more sense for whoever the spokesperson is to be, out on the street on the ground in a rain jacket, that's also appropriate. So just considering, what the environment is, what the issue is, and then kind of crafting your brand consistency around that rather than trying to force it to fit. Social media in a crisis, I will not belabor, not because it's not important, quite the contrary, really because this could be a 5-hour conversation here. I'm sure this is a surprise to no one, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but and this isn't because we're in the midst of a crisis. This is just because social media has become what it is, and that everything is fair game, and especially around COVID, responses are expected. It's really not optional anymore. Individuals are expecting responses because they are getting them from organizations. They've got this instant gratification because they can get, their groceries delivered in under half an hour. And, it's just become custom, and they've just become accustomed to receiving responses. There are very seldom instances where potentially responding is just not going to get you anywhere. But for the most part, those responses are kind of necessary now. How and when to respond is obviously going to be dependent upon the individual situation, but generally speaking, and overall, responding quickly, but acknowledging publicly, that if someone, for example, writes on your Facebook wall and they have beef with something that's going on, letting them know that you saw their message, you hear them, you're addressing it, you're acknowledging it, but then taking it offline and having that conversation with that individual privately, and letting them know publicly that you are going to reach out, for example, via direct message and have a conversation with them there, understanding full well that that person could very easily, even though it's private and it's a direct message, it can still be made public very quickly via a screenshot. So just keeping that kind of in the back of your head too. But providing resources whenever you can, and then saying thank you. A lot of times we see when things crop up on social media, folks want to be heard, and responding to them quickly is going to get you a lot of points with them. And then of course, once the issue has been hopefully resolved, just thanking them for their feedback, thanking them for their time, will go a long way. And as much as social media can be really tricky, especially when there's a crisis, it's also a platform where you can, with proper messaging and approach and tact, be able to address some rumors that may be incorrect about the issue, about your organization. There are some great ways that you can use social media to help push out the facts. So like I said, this is probably a whole webinar in and of itself. We've got a few more minutes here, so I just wanted to touch briefly on kind of what we're looking at when we say, media, whether it's a crisis or not, but just really what What's changed, what hasn't? Newsroom size, as I'm sure you all know, are shrinking. There are fewer in-house reporters. There are more freelance reporters. I think that this actually presents us, and I've seen in a lot of instances with a couple of different opportunities actually. One, because there are more freelance reporters, oftentimes they are freelancing for multiple organizations, and it might be, you know, the same media organization, and it's, you know, one or two of their sister publications as well, but they also could just be freelancing for different outlets altogether. And in that case, if you have, you know, a message you're trying to get out there, it might allow you an opportunity to get that message spread a little bit wider. And I think same thing with the shrinking newsroom situation is that if you're able to give an outlet content that they can run with, they can use, they can basically copy and paste, that can be very beneficial for your organization. Newsrooms don't have as much time to edit content. They don't have as much time to go and fish for new stories all the time, just given the demands and shrinking staff sizes. So there are opportunities in, if you can, you know, if you have good relationships with your local media, you can create content that you can kind of tell they're gonna take and run with, which can be very beneficial. What hasn't changed, these are just very high level, but research still shows Mondays, or at least earlier in the week, is still best if you're trying to push out if you're trying to push out like a press release or communication to media. They still prefer email. I've had dealings with a couple of reporters who have said, you know, we've gotten to the point in our relationship where they just say, call me, you know, don't just call my cell. Here you go. But for the most part, they appreciate, you know, they're going to get just as many emails as we are. They just appreciate email versus hounding them on the phone for the most part. And then content should still be concise. It should still be local. You know, the outlets are always going to try and figure out what the local angle is. If you can give that to them, you're doing part of their job for them, and they're going to definitely appreciate that piece. COVID, I don't think necessarily has changed tons necessarily. There's, you know, outlets are still looking for local content that is tailored for that, at least that geographic region, and if you can, that outlet, making sure that you've got local people on the ground who can be those spokespeople. And then they're also looking for positive stories. But what I will say about this point is that I think when COVID started, we found ourselves in a situation where 100% almost of media stories were COVID, and it wasn't the positive stories about, you know, this organization switching their manufacturing lines to PPE. It was just, you know, virus. Now, and then things shifted, and it was all about some of the happier stories about neighbors helping their neighbors and different organizations manufacturing PPE. I think and we've advanced from that, and that somewhat has been exhausted in the media. And I think now, you know, the media is still looking for positive stories, but organizations have to figure out a creative way to put their own kind of spin on it. So what's the new story? What's the next story? And then finally, just really briefly, some best practices for media relations. This is an important piece of the playbook, but also it's probably more important, you know, in action. It's great to have on paper, but practicing it through media training is also very valuable. Media relations can be great opportunities to correct misinformation. You can solidify, and this is in the instance of, you know, our organization and our members, but solidifying yourself as a trusted, accessible, and transparent provider of information or source. You want to create relationships with your local media where you want to go back to them. They want to come back to you, and they see you as a resource, not necessarily, you know, not a situation where you're kind of rolling your eyes every time the media calls. You want to get it to a place where you have a good relationship with them, and you trust them, and they likewise trust you. And if you don't tell your story, again, someone else will, and it probably will not be the story that you necessarily would tell. Preparing for media opportunities, you know, nothing new or crazy here, but making sure that you're doing your homework on the reporter, on the outlet. You're asking the questions when the reporter calls, you know, what's their deadline? Who else are they planning to talk with? When are they planning for the story to run? Are they looking for, you know, on camera, over the phone, those kinds of things. And just making sure that you've got those talking points baked. They're in the back of your head. You're thinking about other questions the reporter might ask based on maybe their most recent stories or what the outlet's been focused on that day or that week. Making sure you've got all your creative visual assets on hand, and then just doing a test IT run through to make sure if it is, for example, during COVID, an interview over Zoom or another platform, that you're not going to have any issues on the day of. Very general communications tips, whether you're talking to media, talking to a stakeholder, talking to your internal team, but simplifying your message, telling a story and making sure you've got stats to back it up. When you can, being visual to help break up, just text or just other content, and just getting to the point quickly, which I will do right now, Courtney, I promise. And when a crisis strikes, this is what I'll leave you with before the stars of the show get here. But when a crisis does strike, tell the truth, tell it fast, and tell it all.
I'm Andy Fusco. I'm Vice President of Corporate Planning and Member Cities with Electricities. We are the same organization as Elizabeth works for, so I won't talk much about Electricities. I will say that I am not a communications person. However, I will be moderating the panel discussion today. I'm joined here today by Keith Acree, Charles Morris, and that's Morris with an M, or Chuck Morris, I should say, and Steve Karakis. So I'm going to ask each of them, starting with Keith, to introduce themselves and tell a little bit about themselves.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Keith Acree. I'm one of two public information officers that work at North Carolina Emergency Management. We're the statewide emergency management agency for North Carolina. I'm the lead public information officer here. I've been doing this about 4 years at emergency management, but I've been with the Department of Public Safety. This is my 21st year here. So before I served the emergency management agency, I was with the state corrections agency for about 17 years. And I was handling PR for the state prison system, the probation system, and the parole commission. So a lot of interesting crisis communications issues come out of that, as you might imagine. And then prior to that, I was in the TV news business for about 10 years at 4 different TV stations here in North Carolina.
Okay, Chuck.
All right, good morning. Good morning. I'm Chuck Morris. I work for Duke Energy. I'm a general manager for Duke. I've spent about 30 years in the nuclear power industry. I was responsible for our nuclear division COVID-19 response for the first 5 months of the pandemic. And I'll tell you, while COVID-19 was very impactful on our employees, our communities, and impactful on the way we do business, by being prepared, by having that playbook, as Elizabeth mentioned, by having policies and controls that we put in place, and we'll talk about some more, Duke was able to continue to provide safe and reliable electricity to our customers during this difficult time. And my biggest learning related to COVID-19 response is that it takes consistent reinforcement and coaching to ensure that those COVID protocols are consistently adhered to. As humans, we're built for relationships. We want to shake hands. We want to hug each other. We want to be near to each other. And it takes a concerted effort to get folks to behave differently. Thanks, Andy.
And Steve.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be with you. Steve Karakis. I'm a strategic communications consultant in Northern Virginia. My practice is not exclusively, but largely focused on energy issues, and that's a result of my background, which is started in newspapers as a reporter many years back. Worked on Capitol Hill as a press secretary, worked with a couple of public affairs agencies here in the DC area, and then the better part of 20 years prior to consulting, leading the media relations and editorial teams at the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the policy organization for the nuclear energy industry. So that's kind of the range and blend that I have. You know, I think the challenge, it's interesting to me, the challenge of the past several months has been both COVID and the elections, because that just has sucked so much oxygen out of the room in terms of journalists' attention. So that's been the major challenge. And so I'm obviously looking forward to getting past this so we can get back to doing some proactive media work, for example. I'll stop there.
Thank you, panelists. Before I get into the questions, I will mention really quickly that we're going to go for roughly 40 minutes or so here. We like to reserve maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions from the audience. So as we go along, if you could enter into your group chat any questions you might have, and we'll try to pick those up at the end, time permitting. So that said, my first question is going to go to both Chuck and Keith, and that is basically how have your organizations pivoted since the onset of COVID, and in some of those changes you may have put in place, what challenges, what was particularly challenging to you, as well as what kind of became a pleasant surprise. So I'll ask Keith to.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, I mean, I think since the beginning of the pandemic, North Carolina Emergency Management has been intimately involved with the State Department of Health and Human Services in developing and delivering messaging to the public across the state about the pandemic and about what the state is doing to protect the public and what the public needs to be doing to take care of themselves during the pandemic. And there's been a lot of evolution in that process along the way. First of all, I think we've done the same thing everyone else has and tried to figure out how to conduct business ourselves internally, in a pandemic environment and keep everyone safe. In the early months of this, back in January, February, March, when we first started this work, we had probably 30 plus people working together in the Joint Information Center, public information officers and communication staff and epidemiology experts and things from DHHS and from the State Department of Public Safety, all in the State Emergency Operations Center and specifically in the Joint Information Center where we work the public information and communications piece. And as sort of the pandemic evolved and we got to the community spread stage and we realized that mask wearing and things like that really had to become a focus, we really needed to reduce the number of people we had working together and on site. So we looked at our structure and we sort of tried to figure out, and we peeled off groups of people. I think the first folks that we sent home were like the social media team and the website team because they could do their work pretty effectively remotely, either back in their office or from home. And I think secondly, we kind of peeled off the writers and the media relations people. And that really left us with just, working in the building each day, the people we needed to support the daily news conferences. We were doing news conferences pretty much 5 days a week, weekdays, with the governor or with Secretary Cohen or Dr. Tilson back then. And those have now dropped off to once or twice a week. But just the people we needed to support those news conferences to make those happen. But I'll stop there and let one of the others go.
Sure. Chuck, how about from Duke's perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So at the start of the pandemic in Duke, we established a central command center to coordinate our COVID-19 response. And it was based on previous established crisis plans, like Elizabeth mentioned, having those put us in a better position, even though it was definitely new, definitely different, definitely nothing that we had dealt with before. It at least gave us that structure to be able to approach the situation in a controlled manner. So we promptly implemented policies and controls based on Centers for Disease Control, World Health Organization, state orders, industry best practices, all those guidelines to prevent the potential spread of COVID. So we did that very quickly. That included starting daily on-site temperature and symptom screening checks at each of our facilities, signage and other items to reinforce social distancing as social distancing is really the primary means to prevent the spread of the virus. But yet, in having to operate power plants to provide electricity, there's a need to do work within 6 feet of each other, really challenging that. putting a process and procedures in place for what levels of approval are needed to do that. And then if we do need to work, when we needed to work in close proximity, to require those individuals to wear masks, again, to keep folks safe. Cleaning, disinfecting surfaces, especially close contact, high touch surfaces like handrails, phones, those types of things is something that we immediately did. And then we restricted access to certain areas of our plants where some of the more critical functions are performed, so that we minimize the opportunities to transfer the virus to those key operators and folks that are directly involved with operating our facilities. And that included staggering work schedules. So again, we'd minimize the time for folks that needed to be on site for a bunch of people to be in a small area where they potentially could spread the virus. So and as Keith mentioned, we also had folks that can work remotely do that as much as feasible. And I'll tell you, that's an area where I was pleasantly surprised, because I was really worried at the onset that we would not be effective, not be able to be as effective from an oversight standpoint, from a collaboration between employees standpoint, but our employees were very innovative in how we use these technologies, these teams at Duke Energy. And in many cases, I think we have developed a process that's more effective than what we did before when we were doing it in person. And I'm confident that it's going to transform the way we do business for the future, and that even when we're past this COVID-19 posture, we will be using that technology significantly more to do things more effectively, more efficiently, and to improve the way we interface with employees, either in our small team discussions, overall site discussions, or leadership discussions. So I think that was the biggest positive impact I've seen. And I mean, there's challenges, but again, by working together and having those pre-plans, that helped us be successful.
Thank you, Chuck. I definitely agree. It's we've seen, across the board, communication across employees has definitely maintained a high level, and it's an improvement. Okay, I'd like to move on to Steve for my next question here. And the question is, what tactics have you deployed to protect or bolster your brand's reputation, either during COVID or maybe perhaps another crisis? And, how are you communicating to your communities that you're working with to keep them safe through all of this?
Sure. Happy to do that, Andy. If I could, if you'll indulge me for just a few seconds, I'd like to harken back to Elizabeth's presentation, which I thought was just terrific, by the way. Very good. But a couple of points that I just want to amplify out of that. One of which is simply make sure that you do exercise your plan. I mean, I can tell you, coming out of my nuclear experience, where I've worked with a lot of type A kind of individuals, sometimes it was a little bit of felt like an annoyance and a little bit of a pain, but the learnings and the practice that you get from actually exercising your plan is vital. So that's one point I would make. I think the second point I would make in terms of anticipating crises is my impression. You have to think outside of the box. You have to think logically related to your operations, but think outside of the box to anticipate what kind of crises may surface. It seems to me we're in a period now where, as opposed to the days when you mostly had operational kinds of crises, the social issues are just tremendous now, and the potential there. I mean, I think, for example, just this past summer, I was struck by the Wells Fargo CEO who, put in a memo about that there was, a lack of talent available among the minority community for executives in the financial industry. That's the kind of crises that just should not happen. That was just weeks after the George Floyd tragedy, and it just seemed to me that was one where there was no way that that a CEO should not have been better prepared to deal with that type of issue. So that's the one thing I'd note. And then the last point I'd make before I transition to actually get to the question, Andy, is with regard to social media is, and I think folks know this, you have to be engaged and active on your social channels before a crises happen. You have to have a following in place, because the last thing you want to do is try to build that following and disseminate information on social on the fly. You just want to have that network built up ahead of time. You have to be engaged on a day-to-day basis to do that. So turning to actually what your question was with regard to bolstering or maintaining our protection, I'm going to harken back to a couple of crises from my nuclear energy days. One actually way back in 1999, which was the, believe it or not, the Atomic Train two-part miniseries starring Rob Lowe, which was, the plot line was a nuclear bomb that had been put onto a freight train that ended up exploding and leveling Denver ultimately. But the key issues out of that we got were, one, again to Elizabeth's point, is, you know, get a good list of subject matter experts, whether they're within your organization, within the industry or sector at large, whether they're in the academic community. But those subject matter experts can be very important in fielding and assisting with the messaging that you provide. I also would note that the importance of aligning and finding the ally organizations. We did a lot of coordination and communication leading up to that show with the Department of Energy comms people, the Department of Transportation, the Association of American Railroads, for example. So just be mindful, always try to think of the other folks who have similar interests, not always exactly the same as yours, but who can be allies in the effort that you're involved in. The other incident that I would point to was obviously the 2011 Fukushima accident in Japan. You know, the big learning that comes out of that, at least one of them, is, boy, it doesn't take a second to go from 0 to 8,000 miles an hour. I mean, we were so quickly overwhelmed with press calls. And one of the very early things that we had to do was, and I actually think COVID and Zoom would be some benefit in this ultimately, but we learned very quickly that we could not deal with those inquiries one-on-one, and we had to just go to a series of conference calls with reporters. So just be ready for that, because it's going to happen very, very quickly. You just can't imagine how quickly that happens. And to that extent, beyond the actual communications tactics, and Elizabeth laid out a lot of those, you want to make sure real quickly that you're aligned with your human resources people. We ended up in that scenario staffing a media room literally around the clock for the better part of 2 months. And you know, that wears on your resources mighty fast. So you have to have, it's a conversation worth having with your HR people as to what you would do to try to get additional bodies in the room over time. I'll start to wrap up, but the other thing you do, you know, we used all the things that Elizabeth talked about. You have to have talking points in place. I'm a big advocate of having talking points for just about anything that comes along. A lot of the common language can be common to a certain extent in those, some of the standard messaging, but I think it's always good to have a current set of talking points to go by. But we did short videos that we put up on YouTube. We used our blog to carry messages, social media, obviously. We did press briefings. We also, and I think this is increasingly important these days, relative to being visual, was to develop infographics that could be used and circulated. So those are at least and again, third-party experts, subject matter experts. So I'll stop there, but those are some of my top lines on that question.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I think, you know, one thing that might be a little unique about COVID is it's got a very long lifespan. You know, many issues or disasters might last a few weeks. COVID started in March and we're still dealing with it today. So, from that perspective, especially from an emergency management perspective, my next question is going to go to Keith. And that is, first off, due to this kind of long lifespan of COVID, I imagine your messaging has had the opportunity to evolve during that period. So we'd like to hear a little bit about that. But also, since the lifespan of COVID has been so long, and kind of the topic of our session today is other disasters have happened on top of it. So, I'd like to comment a little bit about for you to comment a little bit about how your messaging has changed in the midst of multiple simultaneous disasters as well.
Yeah, sure. So thank you. I think today is day 248 of our state activation for the COVID-19 response. So we've been at this like about 9 months now, I think. And when we started at the beginning, we were real concerned about the upcoming hurricane season, and developing a lot of messaging, both operational guidance for how were things going to work during hurricane season, how are we going to respond to a hurricane during a pandemic, and then from a messaging point of view, what do we need to tell people about what they needed to do differently to prepare and to protect themselves. So I can share a slide here that kind of shows you a little bit of some of our key messaging from the beginning. And this messaging actually has remained remarkably stable. So on the left there, kind of our key message was about, make a plan that if you have to evacuate, make a plan to stay with family or friends or at a hotel if you can afford to do that. What we really didn't want was people to do what they normally might have done in a normal year, which would be rely on a hurricane shelter. We didn't want people to be in a large high school gymnasium kind of setting, hundreds of people together, not where you wanted to be during the pandemic. The other piece of that message was for months and months and months, at the earliest part of the pandemic, for many, many weeks, we told people in that lockdown phase to stay at home. And the message they keep getting was, stay at home, don't go out, help stop the spread that way. So we were really concerned that people would be hesitant to evacuate if an evacuation order was called for their area. So we really wanted people to understand that if an evacuation order came down for your area, it was much more important to evacuate and protect yourself from the life-threatening conditions that come with a hurricane, things like the storm surge and the flooding and the high winds. And those were a much bigger danger to your life than the COVID-19 pandemic was. I mean, most people that come down with COVID-19 do recover and they're okay in the end. But if you've got 5 feet of water coming into your house, you don't want to be there. So that was a sort of a key message early on. And then the other piece of this was, that preparedness piece about, building your emergency kit, which we always tell people to do. And that's sort of our all hazards message for any kind of disasters, have an emergency kit for your family in place. But, you needed to add some things during the pandemic to that kit. Make sure you've got masks, make sure you've got some hand sanitizer, make sure you've got some wipes in there, things that you can to help keep your environment clean and keep your family healthy. So that messaging has remained remarkably stable all throughout the pandemic. We're in the closing couple of weeks of hurricane season here now, and it's not been a terribly bad hurricane season for North Carolina. We did have Hurricane Isaias make landfall in our state. So if you lived at Oak Island or in Bertie County, this probably was a pretty bad hurricane year for you. But by and large, we didn't have a big evacuation event this hurricane season. Haven't had one yet, so we've been fortunate in that realm. But what has evolved a lot, I think, is on the public health side is the messaging about the 3 Ws and the mask wearing and that sort of stuff. And as the CDC guidance has changed, and as we've learned more through the science over many months, we've had to tweak that messaging and tweak the guidance. And we've worked really closely with our DHHS partners, through videos, through social media messages, through all the guidance that we publish on the state's COVID-19 website. We're constantly updating things there and changing them daily, just to keep up with the evolving, changing guidance there, most of which is coming from the CDC, and then we're just kind of tweaking it from a state level perspective. The other thing that I probably should have talked about earlier and didn't was how we've evolved in how we manage these news conferences that we do. Today, we're doing one this afternoon with Secretary Cohen, marks news conference number 100 of the pandemic for us. So this is the 100th time we've done this. We started off in the beginning, we were doing them in our traditional fashion, like we'd always done them, which was, a bunch of reporters in the room asking questions in person. We had stick microphones that got passed around among the group so reporters could ask their questions of the speakers at the podium. And we sort of quickly realized that was a bad way to do that. We went to putting those microphones on stands at the ends of the room. Reporters had to get up out of their seat, walk over to the microphone, ask a question, so they didn't physically have to touch anything to do it. We put the hand sanitizer in place in the room and hand washing and all that sort of thing. Then eventually we came to the realization that just having that many people in the room was a bad idea. As we sort of started to put these gathering limits in place and things. So we went to doing virtual news conferences, and we had to figure out, how do you do a news conference, in a virtual environment? And we went through a few different platforms of trying different sort of conference call technologies until we settled on the one that we use now. We also had to come up with a way to, get the video, the television signal out to all our broadcast partners across the state. UNCTV was instrumental in helping us do that. And fortunately, we had been going down that road before the pandemic started. And UNCTV was really wanting to be our partner there and help us get emergency messaging out. And they had really taken a lead in the public television community across the country in doing that. And then the other big piece of that we have in those news conferences that you see on the screen is you see the sign language interpreters. Typically that person stood next to the podium and interpreted what the governor or the secretary was saying. We had to add some social distance there to get that person away from the podium. So we ended up having to add a second camera to shoot just the interpreter, and then one camera to shoot the podium. And then we sort of put the interpreter in a box up in the corner so you could see them. That enabled us actually to do having that second camera enabled us to do an ASL only stream of the news conference, which the deaf and hard of hearing community really appreciated. And then we also sort of separately from COVID, we were going down this road just as COVID began as well, but we started doing Spanish language interpretation of these news conferences. We have 2 interpreters. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm in a smart room here where the lights go up. Have a team of Spanish interpreters who work behind the scenes to provide live Spanish interpretation of the message. We provide that on a video web stream, and UNCTV carries that on a secondary audio channel as well. So all those things kind of happening behind the scenes in these news conferences. We continue to do those, with the dial-in option. I think to some extent, when we do go back to doing news conferences in person, we've got some people in the press corps pressuring us to do that. I don't see it happening anytime soon, especially with our numbers, going in the wrong direction like they are now with COVID cases. But I think we're probably going to keep that telephone dial-in piece of the news conference as a permanent thing, even if we do have reporters back in the room in the future, because it's what the sort of unexpected benefit of this is it really allows us to open those news conferences up to a statewide audience, audience of the press. Normally we were limited to those Capitol Press Corps members from the Raleigh area that were within driving distance of the State Emergency Operations Center and could come here and physically be here. But now with the phone option, we can take questions from reporters in Charlotte and Nashville and Wilmington, and it really opens it up to a statewide audience. And that I think has been a real benefit for us. And I'm sure there are lots of other things that have evolved as well that I'm probably not thinking of at the moment, but those are some of the bigger ones.
Thank you. And it's been interesting to see, just as a viewer, how, press conferences across the country have evolved over the past years. And it's interesting to hear some of the logistics that go behind pulling this off in this environment. Okay, Chuck, my next question is you being, a fellow utility. I know that Duke has to, contend with a lot of, regulations and guidelines at, every level, state, federal, local level, and those have changed, especially during COVID. So my question to you is, how has Duke balanced putting in place its own internal policies and procedures, with its employees, along with these, perhaps changing and additional regulations?
Yeah, Andy. I mean that definitely happened. A lot of changes over time, and as Keith mentioned, a lot of that came from the CDC. I mean, I think the first part, the most important piece, was setting conservative policies up front. So we took CDC, World Health Organization, other industry guidelines and state guidelines, and we put those conservative policies in place up front, and that helped us minimize the amount of changes that had to occur. But we did have to make changes. As a company, we frequently monitored news and posted guidelines and websites and a bunch of different things. And we also have a lot of contacts with the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, with our local communities. And as requirements changed, then we were aware of those changes. One thing that I think is important is not to overreact to a single source of information, because if you're constantly changing your guidelines, it gets confusing for your employees, for your workers, for the folks they're interfacing with in the community, and it can actually reduce the effectiveness of the controls you put in place. For example, in the middle of the pandemic, there were these stories out there on social media that hand sanitizer could catch fire and burn people's hands and all these other things. And there were some saying, well, should we stop using hand sanitizer because there's a safety issue? Well, we ended up finding out that was not accurate information. And so not really waiting, taking the aggregate of the information, and when the aggregate of the information indicates this is the right thing to do to change our policies, we would make those changes. For example, the COVID symptoms changed over time, and a couple times through the process, we changed our screening questions and the things we did in our communications related to COVID symptoms. Additionally, their return to work requirements changed for folks that might have had a positive test for COVID. I mean, what's required to allow them back in the workplace for those types of situations. So we did make those changes, but we did it in a balanced method, really looking at the aggregate of all the information and working with our partners through the states and our local communities. Another thing that was very helpful was having a structure, and again, Elizabeth talked about a structure for communications, but we had established a structure of twice a week COVID specific communications to all of our employees. And then we had daily management phone calls. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we used Teams to have team meetings with work groups. And then for our sites, even frequent town hall meetings. So we had that structure set up to communicate when any changes were necessary and to talk about the basis for the changes, so that as things changed, I mean, again, we tried to minimize the numbers of times things were changing, but things needed to change. We had a good forum set up to be able to communicate those and to reinforce those changes with our employees and with the folks that we were interfacing with. So I think that's important. And then finally, again, this was one of the challenging areas that I could have mentioned earlier, but as power plants, we need to do outages on an 18 to 24 month frequency to make sure our electricity remains reliable. And we had outages that we needed to perform, refueling outages for our plants. And when we do that, we require a large number of additional workers, and those workers travel from all across the country, or sometimes from additional countries to support those outages. So there's concerns from the local communities that we're bringing in these external folks to our communities to do this work. there's concerns from the workers that they're going to these communities and potentially it's a hotspot area and they're going to get, have safety issues. So those communications, having those controls in place that I talked about earlier, and then ultimately we made a decision that we would test all external workforce individuals within 7 days of them reporting to a site to ensure they had a negative COVID test, made that whole situation very manageable and allowed us to be successfully complete those outages and not have significant COVID spread or have any adverse impacts on our operations.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of logistics associated with a nuclear plant refueling, and it's a lot of people involved. I hear you. Before I ask Steve the next question, I just want to remind the audience, if you have general questions for our panelists, please submit them via chat. I'm going to ask Steve this question here, but then I'll kind of check the chat board to see if we have any. So Steve, this may tie directly to some of the points that Elizabeth made earlier. A lot of our organizations are thin in terms of not having huge numbers of employees. My question is, how can these smaller or shrinking teams best prepare for a crisis when many of those people are fully subscribed with work?
Yeah, that's a great challenge for all of us. I really feel like Elizabeth touched on a lot of it, but I really feel like out of the all that is there, you really got to prioritize on the fundamentals. To me, that's the talking points. It's the media training. It's exercising the plan that you have. And if you don't have a plan, either get outside help or go to a regional or national association, borrow or steal, however you want to phrase it. Don't feel like you have to recreate it all by yourself. These things are out there and they can give you a great running start. I think the other thing is, to me, and she touched on it, it's about the relationships. Just like you don't want to do social media on the fly, you don't want to do your interaction, certainly with the reporters and journalists and other stakeholders in the community who matter most. You don't want to be doing those on the fly. We've done a lot of ed boards over the course of my career, and I honestly, at NEI, I was struck from time to time by some interactions we'd have with individual utilities who would say that they almost would want to write off some of the local editorial pages, and I was always a little perplexed by that. They don't have to love you, but you ought to at least have an open door there and an open dialogue where you can be communicating. So again, particularly in a crisis situation, that's where you don't want to be trying to open those doors and have those bridges at the 11th hour. You've got to have those relationships and do that cultivation ahead of time.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like preparedness is the key. Makes things go a lot easier. We'll ask one more question. I'm going to direct it to Keith, but I'll invite the other panelists to chime in as well. But I think this is a particularly good question, and it gets to the fact that, beyond just, our internal employees, internal stakeholders, in our industry, we have lots of external stakeholder groups, and we need to communicate with each of them effectively, and they're all very different. So, my question to Keith is basically, how critical is it to reach these populations of stakeholders? What channels, how do the channels vary in terms of channel of communication? And how do you tailor your message to those groups?
Right. So, I think it's really critical to leverage your partnerships, when it comes to communicating with those diverse audiences. We have a saying in emergency management that all disasters begin and end at the local level. It's the local governments, it's the county governments and the municipal governments that do the initial response to anything, and maybe there's a state or federal response that comes in the middle, but then in the end, on the final stages of a disaster, it's back to that local level. And it's really those local governments that understand their communities the best, and they know how to reach people in their communities. They know what the local sensitivities are and those sort of things. So we really, work closely with our local partners and with the the advocacy groups and the established groups that are already on the ground in those communities. Because we don't have the answer, as state government in Raleigh, we don't have the answer to everything. And people often see us as the outsiders, and they're more trusting of the local people that they know and trust that are there in their community all the time. So really, leveraging those relationships and building those relationships. And one of the great things that has happened to us during COVID-19 is we've been able to really leverage the partnerships that our friends at the Department of Health and Human Services have. They had, I think, much stronger inroads, particularly into the Latinx community, with advocacy groups and partners than we did in emergency management. So we've really gotten to know a lot of those folks throughout the pandemic, and we've worked really hard to do excellent outreach to the Latino community and other communities of color that have been much more harshly impacted by COVID-19 than other segments of the population. So yeah, it means working with those partners as closely as you can. Some of the tools we've used, I think, that have worked well for us. We partnered with North Carolina 211 early on, and they're a strong, consistent partner of ours over the years. They do a lot of call center stuff really well, but they also can do text messaging campaigns for us. And we started pushing out daily text messages that folks could sign up for. We ran up some pretty big bills doing that. And thanks to DHHS for paying for those. But that text messaging campaign worked really well for us in getting out key messages, as the guidance and things were evolving and as new executive orders were coming out. It was really helpful to have a way to push that information to people as things changed. We've also had a lot of success with just something really simple and basic, which Director Mike Sprayberry does every day, is he puts out an email that we actually help draft for him. But it goes out to a mailing list he's sort of developed on his own throughout the pandemic of about 500 different people. And they're everything. They're folks in local government. They're folks throughout state government. They are local leaders. They are community leaders. They're advocacy group folks. Just all kinds of partners on his list of 500 or so. And it's just a sort of a laundry list of what's new today in the COVID-19 response. And we'll put together, 10, 15 items daily of what's new and what's changed and new resources that are out there or webinars or information sessions or things that are available. And we share that every day. We've gotten a remarkable response, positive response to that. And people love, getting that email from the director every day with what's new. But I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I guess at this point, we are probably at the end of our time. I really do appreciate all three of you. You've done an excellent job. I got to say, I've learned something from all three of you. Unfortunately, on these video conferences, you can't hear the audience give you applause, but I would say, a good round, you're all deserving of a good round of applause. So thank you, all three of you.